Folks, welcome to Isolation Bible Study. I'm Bill Tucker at Concordia in San Antonio, and I have a special guest with us. He's a familiar face at Concordia, but if you're not around here or haven't been here for a while, you maybe don't know Pastor Dave McKnight. He is the Director of Pastoral Care and just an amazing guy when it comes to a number of different things. And he's here with us to help us talk about one very specific but one very important aspect of mental health. You know that we've been doing a 2-week series. In fact, we finished last weekend a series called Peace of Mind, and we were talking specifically about depression from the story of Elijah. And so Pastor Dave is going to help us, and I'll kind of leave that topic for him to introduce. One more thing I would mention to you, we've been worshiping in person as well as online, and if you are most comfortable worshiping online, then do it. Online worship is worship. However, if you are interested in coming back to worship in person, we'd love to have you do that. We've had great success. Campus has been safe. There have been no incidents of COVID-19 from our campus, whether it's school or child care or worship services. So come on back and join us. But part of that process, as we social distance and attend to disinfecting, part of the process is registration. And so we'd love to have you register. Please go to concordia.cc. You can register. It's very simple. You just enter your name and how many people will be attending with you. It takes just a few minutes. But please think about coming back and joining us, because having that room filled with people is really, really special. So, Pastor Dave, you led a workshop for the staff that I found to be very powerful and very, very helpful, because there is a particular aspect of mental health that I think gives everybody, well, it makes us a little weak in the knees and kind of hard to think about.
There is, and the subject matter of that is the subject of suicide. And that's what I'm here to share with you a little bit about today. I want to talk to you about if in your life you're worried about someone, how do you recognize that and what should you do? Give you a little background on me. My specialty is in critical incident management and post-trauma syndromes. And inside that specialty, I also am trained in the #1 suicide intervention program in the world to teach it. And that program, by the way, is called ASSIST, and I want to do this tiny commercial for that. It is ASIST as an acronym that stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. Okay? And you can find that in San Antonio and in other areas, I'm sure, wherever you may be listening from. It is well worth the training if you at all want to learn how to really intervene in the life of someone who may be considering suicide.
Can I take on to your commercial? Because part of the training you did for the staff was a very abbreviated version of that, and it was tremendous. I know I and others that I talked to after we spent a couple of hours together felt no more desirous of being in that situation, but much more capable of at least knowing how to begin the process and how to kind of move through that situation nobody wants to be in.
That training is invaluable, so I would recommend it to you. Again, it's called ASSIST. If you want to get a hold of me to find out more about it, I'd be glad to direct you to find a way to get connected with that training. So today I want to talk to you about what happens in your world right now. Without any training or anything, what happens if you're worried about someone? I want to begin that by using an illustration. So I'd like to have your imagination for a moment, and I'd like you to imagine a river. How did that river get there? Well, it starts with a whole bunch of tributaries and little rivulets that come together. They form a river, and then I want you to imagine that river running, and the river ends by going over a falls. So with that picture in mind, let's talk about how that relates to suicide. The place where all of the little streams and everything are coming together, we would call prevention. There's two things that's happening in there. One is all of the little parts of what made that person start to think about suicide start back here. A lot of times as individual circumstances that just accumulate to a point where they're unbearable.
So building up more and more.
It's building up more and more until it turns into the river. Also back here is where we do prevention work. That's where you advertise suicide hotlines and tell people to reach out if you're feeling bad and all that kind of stuff. Once it becomes the river, that's where we do intervention work, which is the real scary part for a lot of people because they don't know how. And then when we talk about going over the falls, we talk about someone who does take their own life or attempts to. And that's called postvention. That's care for people around it, and also maybe for someone who tried but it didn't work. So you have prevention, intervention, and postvention. Today, I want to talk about that intervention piece. So that is someone who is at risk but has not decided to do that yet. Okay? I want to tell you 5 things about the person that we would say is in the river or at risk for suicide. The first one is this: most people at risk, most people who are in the river, are not looking to die. What they're looking to is they're trying to find a way to live with all those circumstances that have accumulated into a bad situation for themselves, and they're struggling to find a way to stay alive with what's going on. So they're not moving to say, boy, death is my goal. I'm floating in here trying to find a way to deal with all this, and I'm not getting answers.
Trying to get rid of all of that
Trying to
burden
find a way to
that-
handle it, right.
Mhm.
Some people in the river are good at hiding, but most people, they're in view if you kind of know how to watch their story. And they will respond to you if you talk to them about that subject. If a person talks to you about suicide, know this: part of them wants to live. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the conversation, and they would just go ahead and head over the falls. Okay? So when you're dealing with someone, there's a positive thing about this. It's not a negative thing to be there, because part of them really wants to still be here. And if given help, the majority of the time, but not all the time, suicide can be prevented if people can talk and help people find answers.
So can I just kind of circle back? So as you began, so suicide prevention begins with suicide prevention hotline and other kinds of information. By the way, we'll give that number again here in just a few minutes. But those are like the tributaries that are flowing down, and there are all kinds of circumstances, and they're building up and becoming more and more. The person who actually then is in the river, that's no longer prevention. They're
Correct.
Suicidal,
They
so
are.
to speak.
They're at risk.
And so their circumstance is that they don't necessarily want to die, but they don't know how else to get rid of the burdens that they're carrying or the wounds that they're carrying or something like that.
Correct.
Okay. The other thing that I think is important that I believe you said at some point in our training before, we don't know how long the river is before the falls.
Correct.
So it may be out of sight, it may be soon, but it does require that we spot and watch. Because I also loved when you said just a minute ago, people who are in the river are good at hiding, but if you kind of know what to look for or what to listen for, you can identify them.
Correct. In fact, that's one of the next things I want to talk about with everybody today is some people call them lists of what do you look for? What are the things that people do when they're suicidal? I prefer to look at it in a little different way. I believe everybody's life is a story. I believe the Bible is God's story. History is His story. And that we live in this story with God and with everything that's going on. So you know the people's story around you that you may be looking at because you see them not just as suicidal, but you've seen them in other things. In fact, something is catching your eye. Perhaps someone who used to be very meticulous about how they dress, not doing that anymore, and they're not making eye contact, they're not talking like they used to, and they just kind of shuffle and separate themselves, and you say, that's not normal. You notice that because you know their story. So I call something like that an invitation that they're putting out. Sometimes their invitations are conscious, sometimes they're not, but they're invitations into that person's story that says something's wrong. Your neighbor used to have the Better Homes and Gardens yard, and all of a sudden it's weeded and dying and overgrowing and no explanation for why. It's kind of like an invitation to say something in this story doesn't fit. Okay? Invitations usually come in one of 4 ways: an action, something that they say, something that you notice physically, or something that you see them feeling. Okay? And there are a number of those kinds of invitations. I've actually got a little list of them here, and I'm just holding it up. You can't read it, but I wanted you to know that if you'd like to know about exploring invitations, there's a few actions, some words, some physical things you might see, some feelings that you might see someone experiencing. Okay? This is by no means exhaustive, but if you're interested in a list like this, I'd be happy to get it to you. So you can email me at davem@concordia.cc. Say that again, davem@concordia.cc, and ask for this list. And also, if you have any questions or anything else you'd like to know, you can feel free to put those in the email as well, and I'll get back to you and also get a copy of this list for you. It's not exhaustive, but it begins to get you oriented towards the invitations that people are putting out in their lives.
So Dave, when you're talking about the invitations, you said they're not all conscious. Right. Some of them are, some of them are unconscious. But you've talked in the past, kind of tongue-in-cheek, you've talked about spidey sense. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes our awareness of those invitations can be that inkling, something's not right, or maybe you're going to sleep and you're thinking about that person and you go, what was that about? Mm-hmm. And if we give it a little more thought, some of these invitations may come to light, but we need to trust those senses, that inclination. Much better to trust that spidey sense and say, oh boy, it was indigestion, than not trust it and regret that.
Exactly. You should always trust any uneasy feeling you have about someone that you know well enough to know their story. You look at that and go, that's just not right. That's worth exploring. And exploring an invitation doesn't have to be difficult. You can just go to someone and say, hey, you doing all right? They may look at you and say fine, and everything that they indicate says they're not, but that's all right. You've broken the ice. You say, well, if something's going on, just let me know. If you don't mind, I'm just going to be praying for you, and I'm always willing to talk. It's some way of getting the ice broke. But when you see something, don't pass it, because it's no harm. If they're not suicidal and you ever brought up that subject, they go, what are you talking about? Yeah. That's a victory. Okay? Yeah. But sometimes they may be. How do you find out? You got to ask a question. Now, there's some misinformation about the question. People think, I don't want to ask the question because I don't want to make them think that somehow suicide's an option.
Put it in their mind.
Yeah. But here's the thing. You're never going to make somebody go, wow, Pastor, thanks for sharing that, because I hadn't even thought of that before. That'd be a great solution to my issue.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
It's not going to happen like that. So the truth of the matter is, you'll never put the thought in their mind. But interestingly enough, we have found that a lot of people in the river will actually say yes when asked. Okay? Which makes you go, now what do I do?
So how would you ask the question? Would you just be as clear as that?
Yes. You have to be absolutely direct. If you looked at me and we were in a serious conversation and you said, Dave, are you thinking of hurting yourself? And I'm thinking of suicide, I'd probably go, no, I'm not going to hurt myself. In my mind, I'd go, I might kill myself, but I'm not going to hurt myself. So you kind of have to ask. There's nothing wrong with the word. There's nothing wrong with saying, are you thinking of taking your own life or ending your life? But you do have to be specific with the ask, because that's the way you'll get a specific answer.
And part of that is, as you said, people in the river are good at hiding. And so if you give them a way to play with the words, to continue hiding, they will. But there's a chance, if you're very clear with them, they'll open up and tell you the truth.
Right. Now, there are a couple of things when you hear the truth you shouldn't say. And I want to tell a couple of those real quick. Some of them you could probably finish for me. Here's one. You're seeking a permanent solution to a what? Temporary problem, right? It's a terrible thing to say to someone who's at risk for suicide, because their problem is permanent and every solution has been temporary so far and hasn't worked. So you don't want to offer that. Okay? Sometimes somebody might say, well, when God closes a door, He opens a window. Not biblical. Listen, if God doesn't want me going out somewhere, He's not going to provide another way for me to sneak out. So the end result is, it's not like He's opening a door. If there was a window or something open that they could have seen, they would have gone out it, because they're not looking to die. They can't find an answer for what's bothering them. Some people may get a little biblical. the Romans 8:28 thing. All things work together for the good of those who love God. Two things I want to tell you about that. One, that is a promise to believers, for those who love God. It doesn't even have an application in the unbelieving world. But the second thing is, there's nothing good about what they're feeling. And the only thing you might convince them of, well, it's good for me evidently to be where I'm at, and maybe what I'm doing is okay. So don't use that one. God never gives you more than you can handle. I'd invite everybody to start the first chapter of 2 Corinthians and just take a moment today and read that. Find out what the Apostle Paul says is coming on the other side of stuff that they couldn't handle.
Let me give you just a little insider tip. Number one, it's not biblical. And number two, Paul did have more than he could handle.
Yep, absolutely. So look at the first chapter. You'll enjoy the read, and it'll remind you that some things are bigger than our ability to deal with. But there is something that you can do. You can ask them, so what's going on? What you're really saying is, tell me your story. Okay? A lot of people in the river will be happy to tell you their story.
And again, I'm sorry to keep interrupting,
right.
but this is such good stuff because I think in my own life and in my pastoral ministry, places where I wish I had known these important components, but instead of having the burden as the person who's in the intervention of coming up with some witticism or some bright phrase or something that's going to solve it, you don't take that ownership. Right. All you do is just ask to understand the story.
Yep, absolutely. And you have to do listening. And as we know, real listening means you're not formulating answers while the other person is talking. You also have to accept their story. See, stories are different than facts. Stories have emotions, they have feelings, they may have things that aren't correct in them, but that is that person's story, and you have to appreciate where they're at. Your job is not to correct their story, it's to hear their story. But in the process of hearing it, you may find some connections to life, because they still have them, or else they'd have already gone over the falls.
You know, in the story from Elijah that we've been talking about, when Elijah just wants to die, and we finally see him in the cave, and God appears, and he's in the presence of God, and Elijah has in his mind that there's nobody faithful left. It's not true, but it's really how he felt. It was part of his story.
Absolutely. You know, there are 5 good reasons to hear someone's story without trying to fix it. Okay? The first one is, it's quite possible nobody's heard it before. So they've been carrying this load, and they really haven't told anyone. To unburden is going to be good for them. It's going to be cathartic, because it's going to help some of the pressure relieve just because they got to tell the story, and somebody actually listened and didn't start telling them what to do.
Mm-hmm. Or telling them they were wrong.
Right. The other thing is, they might see their situation clearer, because we can think like a fireworks show, boom, ba-boom, 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 but we can only say one word, one sentence at a time. When they tell their story, they might gain more clarity over where they're at than they have in the midst of the fireworks show. Okay? But I'll tell you this for sure, they will feel more accepted and less alone. And there was an example in the class we taught that I told you about for all the people that attended. One day in Las Vegas, I got to church early on a Sunday morning, and the phone rang and nobody else was there, and I picked it up. On the other end was a female who was in the sex worker industry who had already taken a sufficient amount of pills to not survive. She let me know that the conversation and everything matched. And she said to me, "Tell God I'm sorry." And I said, "Before you go, let me tell you about God. Because there's no calling the police, having them run in real quick, sit up tracing things, get all that kind of stuff to find that. She's close to gone. You can tell by breathing and how hard it was for her to formulate the words. But I got a couple of minutes to tell her about God's love for her and how unconditional that was, and that God was ready to wrap his arms around her and bring her home. And then the line just kind of went blank, no sound. But she didn't die alone. And I got the opportunity to share something that maybe she would have never heard before. I don't know.
You know, again, the story gets me, and I've heard it already, but it reminds me of something else that is out there that doesn't have to do with suicide prevention, but it's a truth that's really important. And that is, there is nothing in Scripture that says suicide is the unforgivable sin. That's been taught, it's believed by lots and lots of folks. Dear friends, every sin, except refusing to put your hope in Jesus, every sin is forgivable. And so this dear lady heard the gospel, even though it was too late to save her physical body, but she heard the gospel. And Lord willing, she's with Jesus.
It is one of those thief on the cross moments that gave me a new perspective on how important that moment was from the cross. For somebody to just be in there in that moment and they're not surviving, but they still got to hear the gospel. That kind of love and that kind of just presence goes a long way with people. It is not your job to fix their problems, but when you finish hearing their story, you need to thank them for sharing it. I always make sure that I want them to know that I appreciate that they were willing to trust me with hearing their story. And then I go to talk about what has to happen next. And that's a way to find some safety.
So I think that's really important. And hear this, don't be so quick to move to something else that you miss the fact that this person has just shared with you the most personal thing in their life. They've shared their story. And you need to take the time to appreciate that and to appreciate them for sharing.
Exactly. If you don't thank them and you don't let them know how appreciative you are that they were willing to share that with you, you miss a great opportunity to support them and to connect with them. So for all of you that are home and that are trying to figure out what to do in a situation like that, the best thing I can tell you to do is to use whatever you can to go with them and connect them to help. I'm sure it's in a lot of major cities. I know it's true in San Antonio. Any emergency room will take you, and you can take them to an emergency room if they don't think they can stay safe. We have a 24-hour psychiatric emergency room in the city of San Antonio. You can find it by looking it up on the internet. Okay. And there's also things like the suicide hotline that you mentioned, which is 1-800-273-TALK. Let me say that again, 1-800-273-TALK. TALK ends up numerically 8255.
And because you don't have to be suicidal to call that hotline.
Correct.
They're glad and willing to talk to someone who's concerned about a friend, whether that person is there or not there.
Absolutely. And they are always going to be appreciative of you. And they're always going to be appreciative and confidential with what's going on and help people connect. Okay? So you take them to a place you can find help. Okay? If you're talking to someone and you're close to the church, bring them to a pastor's office. Okay? If you're close to a hospital, take them to a hospital. But let them know that you're going to be there with them all the way through it. And that's the best that you can do. Except for, again, a little plug, learn more. This is only sticking your toe in the water. And the water isn't bad. It's a good place to be to know how to help other people, especially in stressful times. These times, a lot of people are losing their jobs, their homes, their incomes, all the kind of stress that goes along with it. It's a great opportunity to love and care.
You talk about tributaries. There are hundreds of tributaries flowing into people's lives, and not coincidentally, lots of them are the same for many of us. It's just some folks are right at that breaking point. So Dave, as you've gone through this, there are a couple things that I just want to appreciate. One, you've given us this river picture that I think is really helpful to kind of break it down and think through what's happening, how have people gotten to this place, what does it look like. But you've also kind of taken the burden of solving the problem or saving their life off the shoulders of that loving friend or family member and given us some ways to engage with them that actually has more hope than simply trying to stop them from taking an action that they ultimately control.
Correct. Sometimes they won't be saved here. They'll be saved in heaven. Sometimes we'll be able to be a part of helping them find answers to the things that got them in the river in the first place. And that's the real goal.
You know, one of the things that I would encourage you to do, because Pastor Dave talked about the story where he was able to share the gospel with this woman, if it's the first time that you ever try to articulate who God is and what God's love is all about, you're going to be very uncomfortable and you're going to really, really struggle. My encouragement to you is practice that. Have that conversation. Talk about how you would say the story to someone if you need to tell them about God's love, because it's not just for these kinds of crisis circumstances.
Sure.
It's useful in everyday life.
Absolutely. I think practice is an important part for all of it. Imagine yourself, say out loud the question, because everybody seems to stumble a little on asking the question. When you've said it, your mind will hear it and it'll accept you doing it. Think about how you will help someone find help and how you will be able to share the gospel. All important things to do. And pray. Okay? Pray mightily that if God is going to use you in that situation, that He guides you. And be sure to pray for all the folks who are in that situation as well. And reach out for help yourself. Okay?
Pastor Dave, thank you. Again, I think this is a wonderful session. I know it's a hard topic, it's a heavy topic, but the chances that some of us will be in this situation in the not too distant future are pretty high. And so I hope it's been a blessing to you. This is Isolation Bible Study. I'm Pastor Bill Tucker with Pastor Dave McKnight here at Concordia. As Pastor Dave mentioned before, if we can be of help to you, feel free to contact the church. But I hope you have a great rest of the day. God bless you.